Thomas Sowell explained visually. Today we're going to talk about charter schools. All right, so this is mainly from Charter Schools and Enemies, released in August of 2020 by Thomas Sowell. You can also check out Inside American Education. He wrote that in the early 90s. It's pretty good. Just about everything in that book holds up today. And a lot of the problems and issues that they were facing early in the 90s in education, some of those kind of disappeared, but now again, the same exact issues that he warned and lamented in the early 90s are right back. It's really strange to read these cultural issues pop right back up. But we're mainly going to focus on charter schools and their enemies. So here's the issue that we see a lot, and Sowell talks about this, and this is mainly from Sowell's book. We'll talk some more about that later. Charter schools versus traditional schools, they get in the argument of, well, the charter schools say, hey, the data say that we're better than you. And then the traditional school argument, well, you cherry pick the data. You're only picking certain numbers or blah, 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 blah. You can't trust that. You're not really better than us. And then the schools will come out, your traditional public schools will say that actually the data say that we're better. And this isn't just the school saying, this is the school and the supporters of the school and the teachers unions, etc. Actually, we're better. And then the charter schools and the supporters of charter schools and school choice will say, well, you're cherry picking the data. So what's the deal? How do we solve this issue? So, well, Thomas Sowell, being the genius that he is, has found out a pretty clever way of trying to figure out, well, which is better? Are the public charter schools better, or are the public traditional schools better? The problem we always run into with the different data points is that we're often comparing apples and oranges. And so you have to get away from this. You got to find some controls so that we're comparing like individuals or comparing similar students. Often we're not comparing similar students. We're not doing similar situations. The behaviors are different. It just doesn't make for good data. Sowell says, well, we can actually find some data. Here's how we can do it. There are 3 requirements that if we follow these controls, we can have an experiment, we can look at the data and try to find out, are charter schools better than traditional public schools? First data point he'll point out is we need students in the charter school and in the traditional school. These 2 student groups that we're comparing, they have to have similar ethnic compositions. And he points to, again, the problem with looking at data versus traditional versus public that causes the Spider-Man pointing at you're cherry picking. When we look at traditional schools, typically most traditional schools have white students and have Asian students. And typically in charter schools, they tend to have more minority students. And historically, white students and Asian students have earned higher test scores, whereas minority students have scored lower on tests. So if we compare traditional straight to charter, you're not going to get a good data point because we're looking at an overwhelmingly white population versus a minority population, and it's not really a fair or true comparison. It's apples and oranges. So that's what we run into with a lot of the studies where, oh, well, this charter school is better or this traditional school is outperforming the charter school. The controls aren't there for decent data points. We need to study similar ethnic compositions, or else we're doing apples and oranges. He points out another example with the data, right? Show me the evidence. If you've watched the videos of Thomas Sowell, read any of his books, mainly the videos is where he's always saying, show me the evidence, show me the evidence. But if you've read a book and went through all of the citations, the guy's all about evidence. Iowa test scores, traditional public schools versus Texas traditional public schools. The Iowa scores are higher. So Iowa students scored higher than Texas. But when we look closer, we find out that white students in Texas actually scored higher than the white students in Iowa. And the black students in Texas scored higher than the students in Iowa. And even the Hispanic Texas students scored higher than the Hispanic students in Iowa. Well, what gives? How can Iowa possibly have higher points? It's because Iowa is predominantly white. They have more white students. Although they didn't score higher, they have more white students who are scoring higher than the African-American students who are scoring more higher than the Hispanic students. So again, when we don't have controls in place, it's hard to look at the data. You're comparing apples and oranges. We've got to set some constraints and have some requirements. So the first requirement, if you're going to have a real study of finding out whether public schools are more, charter public schools are more successful than traditional public schools, we need to look at similar ethnic backgrounds. The second requirement, we need schools that are in the same building. This might sound strange to most of America. In rural America, and even in most metropolitan areas, students don't go to school in the same building, but there are places where there's a building that houses a charter school and a public school. I know it sounds strange to a lot of the people watching this video. How can you have two schools in one building? It happens in highly populated areas, namely New York City. And in these areas, the reason we're doing this is because if you have students who go in the building and one goes to the charter school, one goes to the fifth floor and goes to the traditional public school, well, more than likely, they all live in the same environment. They live in the same neighborhood. So we're taking away different variables. We are controlling. So we have similar ethnic background. We're also having kids who grow up in the same environment, and they're more than likely going to have similar socioeconomic statuses. So we are controlling. We're getting rid of all the variables. The only variable that we want is charter versus traditional public. That's what we want to look at the difference. We want the group to be as similar as possible. And there is a case in New York City. We can find this. We can make this work so that we can see students of similar ethnic background who live in the same neighborhood, who have same financial, socioeconomic status. And then the third, this one's just kind of obvious. We want to have students of the same grade level. Obviously, you don't want to compare a third grader to a fifth grader. You want to compare third graders in both schools, and they're both going to end up taking the same end of year tests. And we can get this in New York City. In New York, you have the similar ethnic background. You're going to have same neighborhood because they're going to a charter school in the same exact building, and they will take the same test. And it's a rather large sample size. We have 23,000 students. 23,000 students of data to go over to prove once and for all, to have that apples to apples comparison. Do the charter schools perform better than the traditional public schools? So we can take out all the excuses. We can take out all of the environmental factors as best as we possibly can in social sciences. We know that in these types of situations, this is not inside a laboratory, but as close as we can get from a human perspective, this is pretty good. And what we found out, and you can read the book, is that the charter schools overwhelmingly outperformed the traditional public schools. And you can read through almost half of his book, and it's not half of his book, but a large portion of the book is data tables explaining here are the data points, here's exactly what happened. We've controlled for the population, they're the same. Really, the only difference is that one student is being taught from a charter school and one is being taught from a traditional public school. And the charter school taught students outperformed the traditional public school students. Now, the traditional public schools, their argument is always going to be this. You outperformed us because you siphon away the motivated students with the motivated parents. The students that you teach want to learn. They want to go to your school. It's a different student with a different behavior, with a different background. They may be of the same ethnicity. They might live in the same neighborhood. They may be of the same socioeconomic status. But the traditional school says, but mentally, psychologically, they are different. And so you are actually educating different students. And that's why we're not performing well. You're doing the apples and oranges again, says the traditional public school. You're cherry picking the students. You're cherry picking again. You're only taking the good students. Cry some more. So we teach everyone. You're only teaching the high level students. This is a traditional cry or complaint from the traditional public schools and from the traditional school supporters and from the progressives. And look, it seems like a pretty valid point. It really does. It seems to make sense. This isn't like some crazy idea that they concocted. But this has been proven false. It makes sense. I don't fault anyone because I kind of believe that too. It's like, yeah, you're right. Some of these charter schools are doing well. It's because they've got the better students. And the traditional public schools have to teach everybody. On its face, it seems like it makes sense. But we've had economists that have dug into this and said, actually, it's not the case at all. So let's look. So in 2017, 17,000 students applied to a charter school in New York City. I think it's a Success Academy. They only accepted 3,000, and it was based on a lottery. It wasn't that they cherry-picked the 3,000 best of the 17,000. Remember, these are 17,000 motivated students. 17,000 students apply to this charter. So if we're going to play the game of, oh, you're only taking the students that are psychologically different, they have different behaviors. Okay, well, These 17,000 students have those behaviors. These 17,000 students have parents that are all in on education, whatever you want to say. Not to say that some parents don't have parents, some parents don't have parents, that students have parents that don't care, but we can clearly believe, I think it's acceptable to believe that these 17,000 students that are trying to win the lottery to get into the charter school are motivated and believe in education and want to do their homework and value education. So these 17,000 students will apply. 3,000 win the lottery. Well, what happens to those other 14,000 motivated students? The 14,000 students that believe in education, that have parents that believe in education, that value education, that want to work hard, that want to improve their life through education. Only 3,000 win the random lottery that get to go to the charter school. What happens to those 14,000 good students? They go back to the traditional public school. The charter didn't cherry pick. Charter got the 3,000. Traditional public school gets 14,000 motivated students. And what does the traditional public school do with these 14,000 students? And this is not hypothetical. This is what the Wall Street Journal released in a report. 14,000 motivated students did not do as well as the 3,000. If the school's argument was, well, that's because you cherry pick students that are motivated. You got 14,000 motivated students and you didn't do anything with them. So the whole idea of, well, the charter schools do better because they get better students, well, doesn't add up. It's not the case. And we can see the reports. Florida State economists found the same exact results. The students that lose the lottery and go back to the traditional public school do worse than the students that win the lottery and go to the charter school. When we look at the controls, it's the same student. What's the difference? One's in a charter school, one's in a public school. Harvard economist does the same study, finds the same results. The students that lose the lottery and go to the public school, those motivated students do not do as well in the traditional public school as the ones that won the lottery and went to the charter public school. No cherry picking. So the argument of, all right, well, the data says the charter schools are better, but you cherry picked. Nope, didn't cherry pick either. And then, and the data gets worse. So University of Chicago economists looks at the similar situation. What happens to those motivated students that just unfortunately lost the lottery and had to return to traditional public school? Well, we find out that the students that got into the charter school, less likely to be pregnant. The same motivated students that won the lottery and went to charter school were less likely to be incarcerated. What's the variable? The variable is the traditional public school. If officials prefer policies based on such concepts of inclusion and diversity, then responsibility for the educational consequences that follow is theirs and are not the fault of the charter schools. Here's the problem, folks, to explain what Sowell is saying here. The public school has 14,000 motivated students. We have millions of motivated students. What the traditional public school chooses to do with that student is what they choose to do with the student, how they choose to educate that student. Who cares what's happening in the charter school? Who cares what's going on behind your walls? The traditional public school gets to decide how they educate their students, how they get to educate their motivated students, and how they get to educate their unmotivated students. What practices and policies that go on within their doors are the practices and policies that happen within their doors. So if a motivated school wants to if a school wants to stick a motivated student into a classroom with unmotivated students, losing my touch with words. If they want to put them into whatever class they want and they want to use whatever policies and practices and ideological progressive moves they want, then that's up to them. And that is the move of the progressives or the romanticists like John Dewey and William Hurd Kilpatrick. We have followed this policy for 70 years in the traditional public schools, and the results have been mixed at best. Let's just go ahead and say they have not been good. The traditional public schools have the choice to do this, just like the traditional or the charter public schools have the choice to teach the way that they want to teach. Traditional public schools can abandon their failed progressive policies. Traditional public schools can abandon their romantic naturalist views towards education, which have been proven over and over to be false, to be empirically invalid. The practices of these traditional public schools are not based in any scientific evidence whatsoever. The pedagogy that is taught at the teacher colleges to the teachers is not supported by any scientific evidence whatsoever. And yet, for over 70 years, is it more than 70 now? It might be 80 years, about 70, 80 years, we've followed this path. And we continue to do it the wrong way. And traditional public schools, as opposed to saying, well, maybe we aren't doing something right, we need to make a change. And instead it's, well, the charter schools are cheating. Yeah, well, if cheating means they abandon progressive romantic views and just follow that of Horace Mann, that of Noah Webster, or the man E.D. Hirsch. I probably will do an E.D. Hirsch video soon. I know I've mentioned a couple times in videos before. He's the guy that breaks all this down. So I kind of veered off of Sowell there at the end and went towards E.D. Hirsch. But they both have a very similar line, a train of thought when talking about education. But there it is, folks. I mean, it's up to the school. You have 14,000 motivated students. What did you do with them? What did you do? My advice would be, and this is not necessarily something that the traditional public schools on their own can abandon their progressive views, can abandon their fantastic ideologies, and can focus on just teaching kids and focusing on going back to the basics, like E.D. Hirsch says. So there's a lot of things that the traditional public schools, from the federal to the national, to your local districts, to your administrators, to the teachers in the classroom who just decide to go rogue and say, enough with this progressive nonsense that nothing supports. Forget everything you were taught in the teacher college. So there's a lot of people on the path that can abandon that. But now for the red tape and the bureaucracy, that really needs to happen at the government level. And if the government could free the traditional public schools of some of this red tape, then we could have some natural competition between the charter public schools and the traditional public schools. And that competition would encourage both institutions to compete for students and would improve education. But right now, I believe personally that the traditional public schools, A, they've got to make their own changes, but B, if they can be freed of some of their regulation and restrictions, they could be more competitive. Charter schools and charter schools have fewer restrictions and regulations, and it's a competitive advantage. And it's hard for traditional public schools to compete to a certain degree. So that would help. Get rid of that, get the competition. It would ultimately improve. That's it for charter schools. I do want to touch on one topic. There was a comment. It's been a lot of comments. I really appreciate the comments. Please, there's people fight with each other. I never imagined that would happen. I appreciate that everyone's watching these videos, and that's great. I just hope that there's some civil conversation, civil discourse in the comments, but I know better. It's the internet. I'm not really policing any of that stuff, so I'm not really reading it. So one guy says, please just go watch/read Thomas Sowell instead of this guy screaming repeatedly, saying nothing new beyond what Sowell himself does. That's the point. That's the point of these videos. These are gateway videos. The only reason I'm making these videos is so that people discover Thomas Sowell, so they go watch his videos. More importantly, they go read his books. That's the point. Like, his picture's on it. And I tell you, this is what Sowell says. Like, I'm not pretending like these are my revolutionary. I mean, it's kind of like right there, visually. Some learners can't just watch a video of Sowell talking. Now, eventually some learners will get there. Some learners aren't going to jump into a 400-page basic economics test. It's dense. It takes a lot of time. That's not a gateway. That's why I use the visuals for differentiating my education and my learning, because a lot of people can understand the pictures, they can understand the graphics, and they can get step by step to the process. And this is how I do it. And the point is to give the basic ideas and then allow people to dig deeper into the ton of YouTube videos, into the tons of books. But you got to take the steps there. I can't believe. Now, he is right about the screaming. I got to stop with the screaming, And I've tried to do a little bit better about calming down the screaming. Fun fact about this, the screaming during that stadium at the New York Mets Stadium was that it was so loud, the Beatles couldn't even hear themselves play these concerts. They couldn't hear themselves. And so they just outright said that there's no point in playing anymore. We can't. And it wasn't necessarily their fault. The technology wasn't there. Stadium acoustics had not been invented. We were just using basic amplifiers. So there was nothing they could have done. It wasn't their fault. And it wasn't these ladies. They just loved the Beatles. The guys that actually solved this problem and led to arena rock and stadium acoustics, it's the Grateful Dead. That's the wall of sound. Look at that thing. The wall of sound. And so they were techies, I guess, would you say. And they revolutionized that. So if they would have done this, then maybe we could have gotten more live Beatles performances. Thanks for joining me, guys. I appreciate it. I appreciate the comments. And hopefully you go check out some other Thomas Sowell stuff.